I want to start by showing you a slide that is looking at general perceptions of how fast the Treasure Valley is growing. I told you we've been doing this survey for the past 3 years. We started asking a question back in 2016, which was, do you think the Treasure Valley is growing too fast, too slow, or about right? It's really interesting. When we started asking this question a couple of years back, people in the Valley were generally split in their responses. You'll notice that 50% said too fast, but 45% said about right. What's interesting is the dramatic change that's taken place in just 2 years surrounding people's perceptions of growth here in the Valley. Across all the polling that we've done, we do Treasure Valley surveys, like I said. We also do Idaho statewide surveys. This is one of the largest changes that we have seen over a 2 to 3 year period across any of the questions we've asked on any of the surveys. So there is very clearly a rapidly evolving perception that the Treasure Valley is growing too fast. When we look at the results from just this past fall, these were asked in October of 2018, we see that now a sizable majority of people here, at about 72%, say the Treasure Valley is growing too fast. We then turn to exploring what does that mean for people's perceptions of the jobs that local government is doing tackling these challenges. So we asked a question, which is, how would you rate the performance of your city government when it comes to handling growth issues? You'll notice that the most common response here is the one in yellow or orange, however you want to think about that color, which is fair, right? So about 38% said they did a fair job. But you'll also notice a very large number said a poor job, right? Almost 1 in 3 respondents believe that their city government is doing a poor job of handling growth. And about 1 in 4 say good, and very few, at 4%, say an excellent job. So we might read this as people in the Valley thinking their city governments are doing a lukewarm to maybe not great job of handling growth. However, we also have some answers as to part of why this may be. We've asked this question, which is, does your local government have enough funding to deal with future growth? And we find that a majority of people in the Treasure Valley do recognize there's a financial component to their local government's ability to tackle these issues. So 58% said no, they don't think that their local government has enough funding to deal with growth. And about 1 in 5 said that they do believe there was enough funding to deal with growth. So on that note, I'm going to turn this over to Metro, but keep this question in the back of your mind. I'm going to come back up in a few minutes, and we're going to look at what people in the Treasure Valley think about a variety of different ways to generate revenue and raise funding, recognizing that in order to tackle growth challenges, local governments largely do need some money.
Thank you, Jeff. So before we start talking about Ada County and its story, we want to hear your thoughts about what you like about Ada County. So with that, I would like to start the interactive poll. If David can start the instruction for that. It's a simple poll where you can enter a phone number.
Okay, so if you have your cell phones out and you open up the text function in the to box, like where you would put someone's phone number, you're going to enter the phone number 870-501-5547. We're not keeping any of your information, by the way, nor is there a cost associated. And the poll is situated according to numbers. So the question is, what do you like most about Ada County? If you like most its vast open spaces, you'll text 1 to that phone number I gave you. If you like 2, it is a safe place to raise a family, you'll text 2. If you like number 3, it's wide variety of housing, you will text the number 3 to that phone number. And if you like all of the above, you'll text the number 4. Those numbers are still settling a little bit. Give you 1 more minute. Now of course, we could have provided you with other options, but these are 3 things that we know people in the Valley value. So it's looking like we're settling around 40% valuing open spaces, around 30% safety, wide variety of housing options, not very popular in the room, and all of the above's about a quarter of the responses. Okay, let's go ahead and advance the slide. Let's try this again with another question. Mitra, did you want to jump in? Okay. On this one, we're thinking about services in particular, and where schools are located is one way to measure how satisfied people are with services. Just one question among many that we could ask. But this one is, are you satisfied with the location of your neighborhood schools? If your answer is yes, you'll text 1. If your answer is no, you'll text 2. And 3 is don't know or ambivalent. So the majority of respondents on that one, it's looking like almost 2/3 fairly happy with location of schools, which tells us something about growth patterns in the Valley. Mitra, did you want to add anything to that? Okay, well, and we'll advance one more slide, please. Okay.
Piece. So thank you for coming here and spending this evening with us. We really value your input here, and that's why we had invited you. When Jeff said that 72% people in this region are concerned about growth and how fast it is occurring, we as Ada County want to take that seriously. We hear ya. We also recognize that many a times local governments seem like they're pointing fingers at each other when it comes to your service provision and challenges with those. And so we recognize that we need to work on a collaborative process. And we also recognize in Jeff's survey that people recognize that there is not enough funding to continue to pay for growth and our services as we have done. So we are very humbled in receiving these surveys from Boise State every year to kind of recognize where people's minds are on this. And it is interesting to hear your thoughts about some of the things that you like about Ada County. But before I go there, I want to reassure all of you that all of us face some of the challenges that you all are facing in this region as growth is occurring. I am the one who commute on Chinden Boulevard every day during the peak hour and spend 45 minutes coming from my home in Eagle to downtown Boise for work. So I've also witnessed a lot of open spaces getting converted into suburban sprawl in Ada County, and I'm sure you all are seeing that yourselves. But where it hurts the most for us at Ada County is our ability to serve all of you as you are used to. At the driver's license, if you have gone recently and tried to get your STAR card, I'm sure you have waited quite a bit. I did a couple of times because of my own problems of getting things right, but I did. And so I think we hear ya that growth needs a coordinated response from this region. And before this meeting, we met with the region's leaders to talk about how we can put some collaborative frameworks where we can discuss growth, as Commissioner Laciando mentioned, in a more collaborative manner. So it's not Ada County versus Ada County Highway District versus a city versus a school district, but we are all working on it together so that we can continue to provide the services that you're used to. So you all said this about Ada County. You love your vast open spaces in your responses. We recognize that this is an important part of quality of life that draws people to Ada County and keeps them here. Almost half of Ada County is set aside for federal and state lands, which means our foothills are going to be undeveloped for quite a bit of time. And more than 8,000 acres are available for active recreational along our green belts and parks and so forth in Ada County. So we all enjoy this vast open spaces, and I was reassured to hear your thoughts on that in this poll. Also, what is important is it's a safe place to raise family. That was also the second highest answer that you all gave us. I have a 5-year-old, and I feel safe for letting her play in the front yard on her own. And I think that goes to say quite a bit about the safety that we feel in Ada County. And we want to make sure that as we grow, we continue to maintain that safe feeling for our residents in the county. So what many of you and I did not know, I worked on the master facilities plan, as Jen said. When I started working on it, we did not know that we provide services out of 32 locations in Ada County. And as you can see, those locations of the facilities are very ideally situated where people are living. You know, they are in the dense urban areas and more suburban areas where the facilities are getting smaller. Our current capital investment program budget is around $5 million after we end up paying for all the sheriff deputies and all of us at Ada County. Only $5 million are available, and with 32 locations and 1.2 million square feet of office spaces, that $5 million annually goes into paying for maintenance and operation of those buildings, fixing the parking lots after a snow, or fixing the roofs of our buildings. So $5 million doesn't go very far. And in the master facilities plan, we also learned that if we want to keep up with the growth that is envisioned for this region, we need almost $320 million of capital. And if the growth continues in the current way, the way we are growing right now in a very uncoordinated way, where every agency is acting on its own, where Board of County Commissioners are making land use decisions, or City Council is making land use decisions without understanding the service provision side of it. If it continues to grow this way, this portfolio could go down to $690 million in terms of our facilities needs for Ada County. As I mentioned, we don't have this in our budget. So we really believe that we need to work with the region's leaders on a coordinated growth strategy for Ada County, where we can ensure that we are protecting the quality of life that we all have loved in this region. And we are doing it in a fiscally responsible manner as we do that. With that, I want to ask a couple of more questions. So if you don't mind going back to your interactive poll number.
This question asks, how many different entities provide sewer service in Ada County? I didn't know this, so don't feel bad if you don't. What's your best guess? And the answers just correspond to what you would enter. So if you think just one entity provides sewer service, you'll text 1. If you think it's 2, 2, and so on. Does that make sense? Up to 9. How many entities are providing sewer service in Ada County? Okay, take one more minute. Those numbers adjusted quite a bit there. Okay, our most popular answers are 6, 7, with 5 and 3 pretty close behind.
Next question, please.
Mitra, are you going to tell people the actual answer on that one when we go back?
Sure, I'll
You'll come back,
that.
okay.
Yeah.
This question is, how long did you have to wait last time you went to get a driver's license or STAR card in Ada County? Ooh, here we go. People have hot fingers on this one. Okay, the first is 0 to 15 minutes. Number 2 is 16 to 30 minutes. Number 3 is 31 to 60. Number 4 is 61 to 90. And number 5 is 90 plus. That happened to my husband recently. My sympathies. Okay, take one more minute. About 30% of you, 16 to 30 minutes, that's not terrible. through, let's see, 22% at 31 to 60 minutes, and going up to an hour and a half is about a quarter of you. Okay, great. Next slide.
So the real answer to the sewer district was 8. We have 8 sewer districts in Ada County. And the driver's license, you know, we all have waited from 30 to 60 minutes. It's a fair statement. So we recognize some of the challenges that we are putting on the residents of Ada County. And we feel that our services are not all of it that is of concern to the residents of Ada County. It's the schools, it's the water and sewer, it's transportation, road, making sure that, you know, we have enough sheriff and we have enough fire and EMS available to respond to our calls when we need help from our emergency personnel. So we believe that all of that needs to be understood in a collective manner as a region. And therefore, we have worked with our regional planning entity, Compass, whose staff is in the audience. I remember seeing Lisa over there. So we have worked with Compass in doing a fiscal impact analysis for this region. And what that looks at is, it looks at the transportation, public education, public safety, emergency services, public parks, public utilities, all these things together, and gives us an answer if we have enough monies available to pay for all this that will be needed to accommodate the growth. Mr. Carson Bias, who is a presenter later, will talk a little bit more about the fiscal impact analysis, so I'm not going to steal his thunder here, but you'll learn more about that also. We also recognize that some of our services will need additional locations. In fiscal year 20, the Board of County Commissioners have set aside monies, $500,000 to provide a second driver's license. So hopefully our lines will get a little shorter, and there will be a second Western Ada County location somewhere where we can access it a little bit more easier, because as you know, the Benjamin complex currently has some severe parking situation that don't allow us to move in and out that easily. So we do recognize that. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Jeffrey, who will talk about some more Treasure Valley survey findings.
Right. Thank you. So you've heard a lot of discussion about financial needs, and you've seen some really big numbers presented to you about the kinds of revenue that needs to be generated in order for the county to keep up with current growth trends. The problem, right, is that money has to come from all of us, and people oftentimes are not especially excited about giving that money away. So we seek to understand basically what kinds of things people support, under what circumstances, and generally how much support is there for different kinds of financing mechanisms. So I'm going to start by talking about something, a potential way to raise revenue called a local option tax. Undoubtedly, a number of you in this room know what that is, but for those of you who don't, it's essentially a way in which local governments could potentially add on an additional sales tax to sales that were made in a jurisdiction, and they could use that revenue to fund certain kinds of programs. It's important that I point out that right now, jurisdictions in the region are not able to do this by state law, but this is something that's an ongoing conversation amongst elected officials about whether or not voters should be allowed to decide if they want to levy local option taxes in order to fund initiatives that might address growth. What we've been doing with the Treasure Valley survey is looking to see what kind of support there is amongst the public for doing something like this. Now, inevitably, we can't ask about a very specific tax increase that would go to fund a specific project. So we ask a very general question that just says, if your town or city were to propose a local option tax, would you favor or oppose that plan? This is kind of like the responses that I showed you regarding reactions to overall growth in the Treasure Valley. We've seen a pretty interesting shift occur over the past 2 years. When we first asked this question in 2016, the most common response with 48% of people was they would not support a local option tax. Okay? However, over the past 2 years, we've seen a change. In 2017, people were essentially divided. When we asked this question in the fall of 2018, we saw a 10% margin open up, whereby the most common response on the survey was that people would in fact support a local option tax. So again, while jurisdictions are currently not able to do this, there may be support in the community to do something along these lines if the laws were to change. We also wanted to understand, in general, the degree to which people understood sort of the current financial allocations, how money has to be spent from property tax revenues and things along those lines. So we asked a question which was essentially approximately 20% of local property tax revenues are retained by Ada County to perform law enforcement, public safety, and welfare services. Is that more or less than what you expected? It's interesting to point out that almost half of the respondents said essentially, yeah, that's basically what I expected. That's the 46% in orange. But a majority of people either didn't know, thought it was more, or thought it was less. This is going to be a common theme when we ask about financing questions. Is it in general? There's a lot of people who just don't know, which makes a lot of sense. These aren't the kinds of things that a lot of folks spend much time thinking about, although likely many of you in this room do. So I want to turn and take a look at two other possible kinds of ways that local governments could raise revenue. One of them is through what's called a public-private partnership. And I want to point out that what you're seeing here is not the entire survey question that was asked. We gave respondents a little bit more information about what these things actually were. If any of you are interested in seeing the entire questions that were asked, all of this information is available to the public on the School of Public Services website. But we asked if people would be in support of completing a project through a public-private partnership. And we found that there's a fair amount of support across the Treasure Valley for doing so, with 48%, the most common response, people saying yes, they would support this. But like I said earlier, there's also a lot of people who are unsure or don't know. So seeing 30% of people who say they don't know if they would support something along these lines suggests that answers could shift quite a bit, and there's a lot of possible opportunities for education and for feedback from the public. Finally, another means through which revenues could be raised is through development impact fees. These are essentially fees that are placed on new housing developments, and the people who buy a new home would essentially incur the cost, in part, of those fees. So it's a way to raise revenue when there is growth and when there's a large number of new homes being built. And again, we see there's a fair amount of support across the Treasure Valley for establishing or using or increasing development impact fees, as they are used in some places across the valley currently. But again, we see that 20% of respondents don't know or refuse to answer the question. So this is just a look to try to understand, in general, what do people across the valley think about a bunch of the different possible means through which local governments could seek to close some of that gap and raise some of the money that you just saw Mitra talking about. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to her.
Thank you, Jeff. So as you heard, there is quite a bit of feedback for us as to think about what we can and cannot do. We were overwhelmed with the support that we saw for the public-private partnership. For those of you who have used our Ada County Courthouse, that is an example of a public-private partnership where we worked with our local urban renewal district who ended up working with a developer who built the building to fit our needs, and we ended up paying the lease until we were able to pay it off and purchase it off of that. Unfortunately, this option is taken off of the table last legislative session because urban renewal districts would now have to go through a bond or a public opinion piece before they can build some of these public-private partnership for government buildings. We also were encouraged to hear the support for impact fees. And for those of you who are not familiar with impact fees, I'm sure Carson and Michael will talk about those a little bit more, but it is development paying for itself, right? It is generally where you are charging the development for the impacts that they are generating, and then we are using that money to pay for a need of the county that the growth has incurred. So in fiscal year 20, the board has set aside money companies to evaluate use of impact fees. So this was really an encouraging feedback from Boise State survey. In addition to that, in fiscal year 20, we believe that the fiscal impact analysis that Compass is doing, and Carson is going to talk about a little bit more, is not be-all, end-all. We are going to need to have further policy conversations and conversations like this to talk about coordinated growth so that we are marrying our land use decisions and our service provision decisions fairly closely to each other. And so for that purposes, Ada County Board of Commissioners have also set aside some funds so that once the fiscal impact analysis do come out, we can continue to have these conversations and come up with some policy solutions that could put us on the path of more sustainable future for Ada County. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Schneider.
Okay, like I said, we're going to see 2 short expert presentations tonight, so I know that was sort of a long setup and you're patiently listening. 2 more short presentations, because if you're anything like me, you maybe don't know what a fiscal impact analysis is, so we want to give you enough information to have a useful discussion about that. So to introduce us to this topic is Carson Bies. Carson is widely considered the leading national fiscal impact practitioner in the United States. His firm has created over 900 fiscal economic impact evaluations and over 1,000 infrastructure financing studies for public agencies. And he's been in this field for over 30 years. So today he's going to give us a very brief introduction into this thing called fiscal impact analysis and explain why the county is considering it as a tool for addressing growth.
Thank you and good evening. And full disclosure, my mom wrote that bio, by the way. A little bit about our firm. We're based in Bethesda, Maryland, and we've also got an office in Sandpoint, Idaho, and we're about to open one in Boise in the spring. But we have a unique niche where we focus on fiscal and economic issues and infrastructure financing, primarily impact fees, and we've done more of that type of work than any firm in the country. I want to start off by talking about sort of the general state of the planning practice today as we see it nationally as it relates to fiscal sustainability. And the first bullet point here I think is the most telling, and that is, in our experience, most jurisdictions in the United States don't have a true picture or true understanding of what it costs to implement their comprehensive plan or their land use plan, their growth management plan, whatever you want to call it. Also, most local governments don't know the cost of their development decisions that they make on a day-to-day basis. They also don't have a real understanding of where their position is in the market relative to different land uses. They don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about or thinking like individual corporations where they evaluate return on investment. We have seen a movement toward that, particularly since the Great Recession, but in general, it is given short shrift. Why is this all important? Both Mitra and Jeff brought up some very interesting points as part of their conversations. First of all, Mitra showed you some cost projections that have been done by Ada County, which are somewhat staggering. And the bad news is that those are only the capital costs. And the capital costs, in our experience, are only about 15 to 25% of a local government's budget. So we haven't even talked about the operating cost, right? Another point, you're fiscally constrained here relative to other states in the United States. You're a Dillon Rule state, which means that you have to have express consent from the state government in terms of what you can and cannot do in terms of land use regulations as well as revenue raising. And why is that important? Well, you have one of the least aggressive revenue structures in the country. And what I mean by that is, how many growth-related sources do you have? Like where I live in Maryland, which I would argue is the most progressive state in the country in terms of local government revenue, we have property taxes, we have income tax by place of residence, we have transfer and recordation tax on real estate. And to give you an idea how much that is, when I moved to Bethesda, Maryland, when I was 28 years old in the mid-90s, the 5% down payment was the least of my worries because it was 7% for the transfer and recordation tax. So that gives you an idea of how much revenue that generates for local governments in Maryland. They also have excise taxes in some communities, and they have impact fees in most communities. So right there, you've got 4 or 5 growth-related revenue sources that you can use to offset growth-related demands. In most Idaho jurisdictions fund most of their growth through property tax, right? And why is this of a concern? Well, since the Great Recession, the National League of Cities compiles data on revenue adjusted for real dollars. And since we emerged from the Great Recession, which depending on who you talk to was around 2012, we still have not recovered, from local government local governments have not recovered to their pre-recession levels in terms of real dollars, okay? The longest time, or the average before this was about 3 years. So we're now 7 years in, and we're still not up to pre-recession levels. So this should be disconcerting because we have limited abilities here in Ada County and your individual jurisdictions to raise revenue to pay for growth, and that's going to be exacerbated, I would argue, in the future by the fact that you're such a popular destination for other folks to move to. And in our experience nationally, you see that as you get folks like me who move from the East Coast or from the West Coast, we have an expectation in terms of level of service. And so that's going to place more demands on Ada County as well as the municipalities within the county itself. I wanted to talk a little bit about the fiscal equation. When we talk about fiscal impact analysis, we're really talking about how much revenue is generated by new development, what are the operating costs, what are the capital costs, and obviously revenues minus expenditures is your net result. That's very different than economic impact. Okay? Economic impact we define as the cash flow to the private sector. We look at what's the direct and indirect employment, what's the induced spending in the economy, what are the one-time construction phase impacts. And it's important to note that a lot of this economic impact, while important, it transcends jurisdictional boundaries and may or may not trickle down into direct revenue for individual jurisdictions, although it is important to factor in when we make development decisions. We're often asked, well, what is it that a firm like yours does that is different than what our budget or finance folks do at the local government level? And there's really 2 distinct differences. One is your municipal or county budgeting effort is a revenue-constrained exercise. You are projecting revenues and then spending what you can afford to spend. And you're looking at trends to project certain revenues, and you're using state formulas for others. A fiscal analysis is just the opposite of that. It's not a fiscally constrained exercise. We're going to make an assumption, or we're going to determine through interviews with your departments and elected officials, et cetera, what the existing levels of service are in your community. And we're going to make a big leap, and that leap is, what is the cost to maintain those levels of service for each department across the board over a 10, a 15, or a 20-year period? And that's a big leap because of what I just mentioned. You have that budget tightrope that you walk every year, and you may raise levels of service for, let's say, parks and recreation, but in order to do that, you're putting off roof replacements, you're putting off hiring folks maybe at the health department, so you're basically spending what you can afford. And the fiscal impact analysis is going to say, this is what it costs, now let's see if the revenues are there, and if not, we're going to have to find ways to ameliorate those deficits, or we're going to have to accept lower levels of service, or we're going to have to find alternative sources, such as a local option sales tax, in order to fund these shortfalls. So what kind of questions can we answer with fiscal analysis? And here's a few of the sort of the common ones we look at. We get hired a lot as part of larger planning teams, and we've worked with Michael Lauer and over the years as well as part of these teams, where we look at, well, what is the fiscal sustainability or the fiscal impacts of different development patterns, the relationship between infrastructure cost and densities, how does the geographic location of new development play into the cost structure, et cetera. We also do a lot of analysis relative to economic development incentives. What's the best way to spend the money and maximize your return on investment? A big question a lot of local governments are asking relative to the point I made earlier about the declining revenues keeping pace with growth since the recession, is this idea that a lot of Western communities that have local option sales taxes get into, particularly on construction materials, is they sort of live off tomorrow's growth. They get addicted to a revenue cycle that gives you this one-time revenue with each building permit that they then use to augment their operating budget rather than augment their capital budget, which is the more fiscally prudent idea. And finally, we do a lot of work related to annexation. Now, some of the things that we're doing more work around recently is looking at the fiscal impacts of different lifestyle changes, different behavioral patterns, et cetera. For instance, up until 2 years ago, it had been about 10 years since I'd been in Boise, and I was amazed at the changes, particularly downtown. And I think if we're all honest with ourselves, 15 years ago, we would have never guessed that empty nesters would want to live in the same places that millennials want to live in many communities. And that's a demographic trend, and it has consequences relative to the fiscal equation in terms of transportation, spending habits, the way we provide services if our demographic gets older and we age in place over time versus a high turnover of residents within the community. Next, I'd like to sort of talk to you about sort of the drivers of fiscal impact analysis and then show you some examples from nationally and not dive too much into the detail. But I would like a show of hands, and since I am an economist and not a planner, I don't have a fancy gadget to punch in our survey codes in. So I'm just going to ask for a show of hands. How many folks in the room think these two bullet points are true? The first is that non-residential doesn't pay for, or excuse me, residential development doesn't pay for itself, and non-residential always pays for itself. How many folks think that's true? Okay. How many think it's not true? You guys are the ones that are right, and we're going to show you why. So there are many drivers of the fiscal equation. The primary one is the revenue structure, and that consists of two factors. One, what are your growth-related revenue sources? I gave you the comparison between Maryland and Idaho. But more importantly, what are those distribution formulas, particularly as it relates to states that allow sales tax? For instance, there are states like Florida where sales tax goes to the state and is distributed based on population. But then they also have the option to adopt a local option sales tax that stays in the jurisdiction. In a lot of western states we work in, like Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, the local governments, particularly the cities and towns, their primary source of revenue is sales tax, and it's by place of, or where the site is based or point of sale. And so that can change the fiscal equation dramatically. Other things that determine the impacts are the characteristics of new development. I touched on that with sort of the lifestyle choices and things like that. But also, the demographics in terms of persons per household, vehicle trip rates, employment densities for non-residential development, pupil generation rates relative to the school district. The levels of service that you've chosen to fund in your community also is a huge determinant in the fiscal equation. And finally, what your existing infrastructure capacity is, which is very, very tied to where you are in your evolution as a community. Are you a newly emerging greenfield suburb? Are you an older central city like Minneapolis, St. Paul? Are you an older suburb that's now starting to have redevelopment? All of that plays into what your infrastructure costs are. And I'm going to show you some examples from around the country that may start to get you thinking for our conversations that we have afterwards. But this shows you, the impact of retail versus office versus industrial in Arizona, where again, point of sale sales tax is the primary revenue source. So you can see from a fiscal perspective, you can see why communities in Arizona are fighting each other for retail, okay? Because of the huge surpluses. But you take those same general uses and let's assume they're in Ohio, you get a very different fiscal picture because the city and town revenue source is primarily based on income tax, and it's not income tax by place of residence like in Maryland, it's by place of employment, okay? So everybody's competing for jobs and economic development. And you can see here the results are completely different, and it's all due to the revenue structure. Retail has lower wage employment, generates deficits on a per 1,000 square foot basis, primarily due to transportation impacts and public safety impacts, whereas office and industrial generate significant surpluses per 1,000 square feet. This, I think, is a cautionary tale of how we treat or view single-family housing. This is from Sarasota County, Florida, and you can see here, I'm going to focus on Bel Air Estates, Greenfield, and Summerwood, but all three of those subdivisions are single-family uses. And you can see here, in one instance, they generate surpluses, and the other two, they don't. But there's reasons for that, okay? Bel Air Estates is empty nester, large lot, McMansion type development, and they generated absolutely 0 children to Sarasota County Public Schools. Whereas the other two single-family subdivisions are more modest and sort of mid-level priced subdivisions with tremendous amount of school children, lower assessed values. And so we just can't make these blanket statements about different land uses because there's so many variables involved. Now I want to share with you a few studies from around the country. Again, hopefully it'll get you start thinking about these things and sort of tee up Michael Lauer for some of his discussion. But there's essentially 2 types of analysis we do. The first one is what I'll call a project level analysis. We look at different scenarios over time. It's viewed in isolation, typically prepared in conjunction with a development proposal. So this is Draper, Utah. We looked at a development there called Suncrest, and we always want to run the developer's optimistic scenario against alternatives. So, whoops, I clicked too soon. The first scenario shows there's a net deficit in the first year, and then everything's rosy. Well, we posed the question, what happens under multiple scenarios? One of them being, let's assume you get 75% of the development over time, and look what happens. You don't generate surpluses until year 14. And that's valuable information that you can be armed with as a local government in terms of negotiating development agreements, et cetera. And finally, we want to talk about area-wide analyses. This is what we do most of, and this is when we're part of these teams with Michael Lauer and others, where you're looking at county-wide, town-wide, city-wide planning efforts or area plans or corridor plans where you look at scenarios over time. Those scenarios can evaluate multiple development scenarios, including land use mixes, patterns, paces of growth, and economic activity. This is a study from Queen Creek, Arizona, where the development community lobbied the town and said, look, the market's just not here for retail. It's for multifamily and industrial, and we were hired by the town to look at it, and lo and behold, the development community was right. And we looked at the fiscal findings under these 2 scenarios, the existing plan versus future, and we see that the future plan on an annual basis generates much better results. This shows it differently, where if you stuck with the current trends, it's basically a break-even proposition, where if you go with the future plan, which entertains motions for land use changes, that you get more revenue than you do in cost, and it's a fiscally sustainable pattern. And finally, relative to Ada County, I wanted to show you this map from Hillsborough County, Florida. But the idea here is to show you how diverse a county this large can be in terms of the different factors that would be part of a fiscal analysis, where you have a central city, Boise. Hillsborough County has a central city, Tampa. They also have suburbs like Plant City. You have suburbs. All of these, you can't treat a single family house in Boise the same way you do in Meridian or Eagle or some other community, or in the unincorporated county. The same with retail, the same with office. So this allows you to tailor the inputs into the model, which results in more credible analysis. And one parting thought I wanted to leave you with is that I get accused a lot of being anti-development, and that's not the case at all. Developers are not to blame whether their projects pay for themselves or not. It's entirely dependent on the revenue structure in that state. And secondly, when was the last time your jurisdiction raised the property tax rate, right? Or the sales tax rate, or whatever. There are all sorts of factors that go into this. Every community has contributors and recipients, meaning land uses that pay for themselves, land uses that don't. Again, they vary by state and by revenue structure, but it's important that we as a community understand those relationships, understand our place in the marketplace, our position in the marketplace, and craft a land use plan that makes it whole sustainably, or fiscally sustainable, recognizing that we have to make up for certain deficits that we're going to have with other uses that do generate surpluses. And with that, I thank you for your time.
Okay, that was Carson Buys. So that is fiscal impact analysis, which is something the county is considering in terms of being able to collect information for decision making. We're going to blow things out a little bit now. by turning things over to our final presenter, Michael Lauer. Michael is the principal of Michael Lauer Planning. I promise we'll get to questions and comments shortly. I see a few hands. He has served local governments all around the country. He's worked in this area for over 35 years. He has expertise in guiding growth discussions in both urban and rural jurisdictions. He's developed multiple adequate public facilities documents, concurrency of service, provision documents nationwide. And he's going to talk about some of the tools that may or may not be available to the county in order to address growth.
I know a couple of things about everyone in here. First of all, everyone in here knows more about how growth has affected you than I do. You have to live with it here on a day-to-day basis. The other thing is, you cared enough to come out tonight to help participate in this conversation, the beginning of this conversation, to figure out, how do we deal with these growth challenges? How do we protect those things that we really love about our community? What things are we trying to preserve? What things do we want to change? And you're to be commended for that. And I say that with all humility, and that I have worked in a lot of different places, but you are the experts here tonight, and we hope to hear from you as we get further into the conversation. What I'm going to do is really talk about three questions. How do we know what we need to know? How do we know what we should be doing? Carson has spent some time talking about that and talked about it from the fiscal side. I'll go into it from a little bit different perspective. What's in our toolbox? Some of these tools will be easier to implement than others. Some of them will require some legislation. But these are some tools that have been used throughout the country, sometimes to good effect, sometimes not, and I'll talk about that as well. And then the real focus is, which of these tools are best at addressing the timing and costs of growth? And that's the question, the fundamental question I was asked to speak to. Very often I go into communities and people will say, boy, this community was great until I moved in here and it's gone downhill ever since. Never putting two and two together that maybe they had something to do with that. Well, the reality is, when we move into a community, we have a level of service, we have some expectations, but that changes, particularly when we have such a desirable place to live. This picture, by the way, is from Austin. I cut my planning teeth in the city of Austin, in that area, and they had this approach in the 80s that if we don't build it, they won't come. That didn't work. They weren't prepared for what was coming. Now, they don't enjoy as much public land as you have here. They had a lot more private land that they had perceived as being open space, and so that was part of the problem. But the reality was, they denied the inevitable that was coming to them, that they have a very desirable environment, as you do, and people want to move here. And that's going to create some changes. So how we deal with it is up to us. Compass is about to launch a process, and I hope all of you will stay abreast of and participate in. It's called a scenarios analysis. It's really asking the question, where should we grow? How should we grow? How should we pay for it? And the way that process works is that there will be some growth scenarios that are developed where we take our presumed growth and we figure out, where does that fit? How does that fit into our future? How would we like to see that occur within the Treasure Valley? And then the hard work comes in figuring out what are the relative impacts. And that's where Tyson's work steps in a big way to look at what are the fiscal impacts of that, but also many other people will be involved in the process to figure out, what does that mean for traffic congestion? What does it mean for schools? What does it mean for emergency services? What does it mean for the character of our community? And this is a little snippet I took. I've been fortunate that the city of Durango, Colorado had hired me now 4 times to go through the scenarios process with them. And it's been great to do that because we went through it the first 3 times and got fairly similar results, that if they had a more compact development pattern, their transportation system would function better. And this was very useful because for those people who wanted to push everybody outside the community, they realized, oh, if everybody lives outside the community and all the jobs are still inside the community, our traffic problems get much worse. There's no way we can deal with them. And what was interesting is just a couple of years ago, I went back and redid this, and we took the growth that they've had and looked at their scenarios, and they found, oh, now we can accommodate some external growth and the numbers will be better because they had reached a critical point for infill, that they really couldn't accommodate significant additional infill. Now, the point of I'm sharing all of this is that scenarios process must be a credible process as you're going through it. It needs credible fiscal analysis as part of that, credible service analysis. But there's one other thing it needs that nobody, wrong way, that nobody can provide better than you can, and that is the introduction of values. What do we value? I don't know that Carson mentioned it just now, but while we're looking at fiscal analysis, a lot of our decisions are not just fiscal. They're about character, they're about open spaces, they're about things in our neighborhood that we love, our schools. They're about protecting those things that we love. And so that has to be part of the analysis too. I'm going to use the term growth management. Carson has used it, and I think he already said this, but I'm going to reiterate it, and that is growth management is neither pro-growth nor anti-growth. In fact, it may be both, depending on where you are in the community or what type of development is proposed. Growth management is just saying, we're expecting changes. What is the way that we can help manage those changes so they lead to the best community? Carson has talked about some of the fiscal tools. I'll mention one of them in passing in just a bit, but most of your regulations that address development, or your land development regulations, focus on where growth can occur, how intense it is, what's the density that's allowed there, what mix of uses do we have in that area, who's going to provide the infrastructure, what infrastructure is needed, and how does it get paid for. Those are critical items, all parts of your code. More and more communities are paying closer attention to design, and from the little bit that I've driven around since I was last here, which has been a little over a decade, you're paying much more attention to design and the character. The critical part of this is that when we talk about the capital facilities that I'm going to emphasize, that design is often important to make sure that they work. If you have transit, but you can't get to it, that transit, nobody's going to use that transit. So most of what I'm going to talk about is timing. And a couple of comments. We've mentioned impact fees. Impact fees are just one-time charges for the proportionate share of capital costs. We'll talk a little bit about growth caps and then also focus on adequate public facilities. As I said, the impact fees, it's a one-time charge. It's only the fair share or the proportional share of those capital costs, and just capital costs, not operating costs. The problem is, Very often we think, oh, we have impact fees, growth is paying for itself. Well, the impact fees actually lag. By the time you collected enough impact fees to pay for a facility, very often that facility has been in demand for quite some time. So your level of service has dropped. They only fund the proportionate share of development. That's important because they don't cover existing deficiencies, they don't cover external demands from other jurisdictions, and they don't cover operations and maintenance. So what do we do about growth? Some communities, as a matter of fact, there are estimated over 1,700 communities, have said, let's put a cap on the rate of growth. I think it was around 1970 that the city of Boulder did that. And they said, we're not going to grow faster than 2%. Well, Boulder has the most expensive housing in the region. It also only worked because Boulder convinced the county not to approve any development around them. They weren't the only game in town, or they were the only game in town, so they could do that to some extent. But they've also found there is no affordable housing, therefore they have to subsidize housing. They have to subsidize groceries. They have to subsidize health care. They have to pay for some of the economic impacts that they didn't really expect to have. So those unintended economic impacts are critical, particularly for restaurant owners who they have to bus people in from out of town to work in their restaurants because nobody can afford to live there and work in their restaurants. So another one that I think has I think growth limits are difficult here because we have so many different jurisdictions. You squeeze that balloon and the development will go elsewhere, and that won't necessarily solve your problems. Adequate public facilities, though, really do measure whether we have adequate capacity at the time development is created. And to implement those, we have to balance several things. How much capacity do we have? How much demand do we have? Hopefully demand does not exceed capacity. What's our level of service? How long do you want to wait at an intersection? How many temporary buildings do you want to have at a school? How long do you want to wait for the ambulance or the fire truck to get to your house? That's our level of service. And then that's all bolstered by a capital improvement plan because local governments have to make a good faith effort to solve some of those problems, to meet those existing deficiencies. If they don't, none of this is defensible. There are a lot of considerations to take in mind when going through the process of developing adequate public facilities ordinances. I'm not going to go into these in great detail. I'm going to focus on a couple of these factors that I think are important. First of all, what happens if we don't have adequate facilities in place? Well, you have some choices. You can wait. Development waits until there is capacity, till the capital improvements plan provides that capacity. You can reduce demands either by phasing developments or reducing density or taking another approach. One approach that's increasingly common is pay and go. This is something that's used in Florida, the concurrency program, that if the applicant wants that development to go before the facilities are in place, they can pay the capital costs of those facilities and then proceed with development. And the fourth one is to reach that public-private partnership, a development agreement. Adequate public facilities requirements are not a panacea. There are lots of ways to do them wrong. In the 35 years that Florida has been doing them and the 30 years that Washington State has been doing them, they've solved a lot of the problems. They've fixed a lot of problems. Not all of them, but at least we can see anticipate what those problems are going to be. One of the problems is failing to address the deficiency. one of the things that's become increasingly clear is you can't build your way out of congestion. Traffic is like a fluid. The more capacity you open up, the more traffic moves into it. So there's an induction factor that you induce traffic by providing excess capacity. This interchange that you see on the lower right was overcapacity the day it opened. And I have to say it was, maybe 3 weeks ago, I was down in Doral. Coming home, I waited, I had dinner, and so it was 7 o'clock before I headed home. It still took me nearly an hour to get through this area. It was bumper to bumper. The other one is we don't necessarily always want to provide that capacity. If you look at that picture on the top right, I think I can still sprint across there and make it. I don't think I could get my mother across there. And I darn sure wouldn't want to live anywhere near where I had to cross that road. That isn't the character I'd want to see. So sometimes we can build things that aren't necessarily what we want to have long term. And if you look at the picture in the lower left, this used to be a double-decker highway. This is by the Embarcadero in San Francisco. When the earthquake knocked down the double-decker highway, or the elevated highway, they said, let's not build it. Let's take another approach and create a better place. Oh, the final thing on the list is that if you think about it, where do we have the most capacity? Out in the middle of nowhere. The farther I get from utilities, the farther I get from employment, the farther I get from other houses, the more road capacity I have. Bingo, I can go through this adequate public facilities test. But if I'm downtown, oh, it's already congested, there's no capacity, I can't do anything. So what we've had to do in the field of working with adequate public facilities is figuring out how to adjust those levels of service so they work, and figuring out how to, in some cases, waive them to say we'd rather have congestion. Downtown Orlando is doing wonderfully now, but that's because they've decided we don't care if it's a parking lot for an hour a day or 2 hours a day, because we want walkable streets, very livable downtown. Just some closing thoughts. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time. 1 minute. Okay, I can wrap this up in 1 minute. This will never work unless you stay with us, that you help champion this, that you support your leaders, your decision makers, as they go through the process to bring all of the jurisdictions to the table. Because this doesn't work if only one jurisdiction does it. It has to involve regional coordination on it. We have to address the capital and the funding side. We have to make sure that the stakeholders understand what the potential implications are so we know how to address them. If we're going to do something that's going to jack up housing prices, how are we going to address affordable housing or workforce housing? We've got to be able to go through this process to get it right the first time, and I guarantee when you do it right the first time, you're still going to need to make some adjustments, so long term you need to stay with that process. And with that, I want to thank you again for coming out tonight, because you're going to help solve the problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, your turn. You ready? Here's what we're going to do for a process. I'm going to ask our experts to come on down. We have 2 roving mics that will circulate around the room as you ask questions or make comments. You can ask our panelists questions. Before we do that, I just want to give you a few minutes to talk about what you heard at the tables, to start to articulate questions you might have, concerns you might have, sort of prime the pump for the conversation a little bit, and then we'll turn things over to you for the public portion of the meeting, okay? All right, so if you have new people at your table, make sure to introduce yourselves. Let's just take about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back to you, okay? Whoa, that's an invitation. All All right, thanks, folks. Go ahead and have a short conversation with folks at your table, please. Thanks. Okay, folks, a few more minutes. right, let's go ahead and come back together. Thanks, everybody, for talking to your neighbors. So let's see, Brianna and Brent, can you raise your mics? These two folks have mics, and so if you want to participate, you have something to say, I'll call on you just to keep things orderly. If you could wait till a mic gets to you so that everybody in the room can hear you. The acoustics in here are a little tough. That would be great. So again, comments are fine, questions are fine, and if it's a question, we'll try to find the right expert to respond to. Okay, right here, Brett. Can you tell us your name?
Gary Rader, Boise. I'm part of the Neighborhood Association as well. We were talking about different approaches to impact fees and development fees. Elsewhere in the country, I'm told that you can not only get an initial impact fee from a developer, but you can also attach a debt to the property that the new homeowner is going to be paying into either capital or the operating cost for a period of time. Does Ada County have the ability to assess that kind of an impact fee that would correctly transfer the cost of growth to the new owner, to the developer, and not spread it among all the current property owners via property tax?
You have a follow-on, it's related? Okay, hold on, wait for the mic, please. And if you wouldn't mind standing, we're streaming, so.
Yeah, my name is Drew Bramlin. Just to tack on to that, we were just having a discussion at our table that, you know, although realtors are opposed to it, I've lived in towns where there are transfer tax. I can't remember who brought it up, but transfer taxes are a solution to get people to, you know, contribute to our government to pay for the services that they need. And then, you know, one other comment was I just wanted to, you know, say that I found it a little bit disappointing that we talked all about money and not about the conservation after the first bullet point was, hey, everybody in this room wants open space, yet we didn't address that today, so. Okay, I want to come back to the conservation comment in one moment. Michael, do you want to say anything about the, Carson? Thanks. Carson,
Yeah,
go ahead.
If I understood the question correctly, I'm not sure the second part of what you said is actually an impact fee, unless it's what we call a time payment of impact fee. But normally, and are you saying it's you're paying? I'm just going to use roads as an example. You're paying a road impact fee, then you're paying an annual fee for roads. Okay, that's not an impact fee. You're paying your impact fee, which, as I understand what you're saying, you're paying that one-time capital cost. Then you have some sort of benefit charge or special district, or, you know, in California they call it Melrose districts, metro districts in Colorado, that you're then getting an assessment for on an annual basis. And I think that, I mean, I don't know of any state where, and special assessment districts take many forms or called different things, but I don't know of any state that doesn't allow special districts. So I think they're allowed in Idaho, but someone may be able to correct me on that.
Okay, and Michael, do you mind taking the conservation question? Because you talked about values broadly beyond fiscal, and so I just wanted to give you a chance to respond to the comment we heard about how do we think about those things and not just about money?
I've got the mic and I'm not even sure I understand the question. So could you repeat the question?
I'm loud, so I can do it anyway. The question is, when we started this conversation, 40 or 50%, yeah, thank you. 40 to 50% of the people in here said that the most important thing to them is open space. But we just talked about money today. We didn't talk about how do we protect that open space, so that the reason people want to live in Boise, Idaho and the surrounding areas is because we have open space. We don't want 55, for example, to become the next Eagle Road, and that's what developers would like to see happen. And, you know, that's the question. I also didn't hear the transfer tax comment addressed.
I'm not sure where the state stands on transfer taxes. We certainly have them. I live in Florida, and even when I refinanced my house, I paid a transfer tax. So I've done it twice. But in terms of conservation, that really is part of the scenarios process. You start off by saying, what are we trying to protect? Before you start identifying where you want to grow, you have to decide what are our assets we're trying to protect. So that really comes into the scenarios process. We haven't talked about it because that isn't the focus of what our conversation was tonight, but that's inherent in that whole scenarios process. And then it has ties also to what are our development requirements, what are our plans for purchasing open space and protecting it.
Okay. We have another question here, and then I'll come to you in the back. And if you would stand when you ask your question, that would be great.
Hello, I'm Cindy, and I live in CUNA. You were talking about the fiscal impact surveys or analysis you're going to be doing, and I thought we already had something like that with the compass. And I noticed that every time a project comes before the board, it has the data there that Compass is making the recommendations, but they never talk about it. You know, like it says, okay, if you build this subdivision, there'll be 0 jobs. It might have an impact on, traffic, whatever, but they don't recognize it. So I'm wondering, what is the purpose of that, and can it be used somehow that they can consolidate all of these reports they get, and they would find, that maybe the growth's too fast, or,
Meta Cooper from Ada County.
So Lisa Itkonen is also in the audience from Compass, so please correct me if I'm saying this wrong. But yes, every development applications beyond certain scale does get transmitted to Compass in Ada County, and they do provide us a development checklist. But what many a times we have noticed in practice is that checklist is not taken seriously. So you're right about that, and that could be because of how our legislative framework is, because cities have very much the ability to make the decision after considering what they considered in the process. So I think, it's the way our legislative framework is why I think cities are. And that's where these conversations need to eventually go. And we all need to stay with it and support, the process, because we do, in the past, the efforts have been made in that direction, where we do the adequate public facilities ordinance and so forth, but has failed because of lack of leadership and support at the time. But I think with this new momentum towards growth, I think we can capitalize on that and work together to find a solution that is palatable to the entire region, not just one city or a county. And I'm sure your cooperation as we develop that would be really valuable. So.
Okay, I have a question back here, Brianna. Thanks. And again, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself. Thanks.
Gary Smith, City of Star. I was on the Star City Council for 4 years, Economic Development Committee. Growth has been a big concern. I moved to Star 14 years ago. It was 1,800 people. Today we're at 11 to 12,000 and growing very fast. What I've seen in getting involved in all of the compass planning and all of the planning that has been presented today is that these plans are good, but there is no teeth associated to any of the plans. And when I say that, Compass can put out a number and say, okay, we think by 2040 we should grow at 4.5%. CUNA said 4.5%. Star came in at something else. I've seen these numbers, but the legislature will point and say it's up to the city, and the cities will say they can't do it to stop or put a cap on it. And everyone says you can't cap growth. Well, you need to manage growth, because growth is very much like if you were running in a battle. You can't outrun your supply lines. And what's happened here and what I've seen is we've outrun infrastructure. ACHD, ITD, Compass, Canyon County Highway, and the City of Star will go and tell the city, whoa, let's do a traffic study, let's take a look at this, let's do something, and yet the city will still go ahead and make the decision, even though they've been told by 4 agencies. So there's a gap, I think, in the process. Growth is going to come, but you have to be able to manage. So my question is how do we convince either the legislature or the cities, one or the other, to give control so that there can be somebody at the city level or at the state level that says, okay, we have to maintain this level, and then they can tell everyone else, Ada County, the Canyons, the Canyon County and Ada County, what it's going to be. So how do we put teeth into these plans? Because right now, they're useless. I hate to say that to all the people that put the time in. They're useless because there's no teeth. You can turn around the next day, put it back in the drawer, and there's no action. So how do you put teeth into it?
That's a great question. You want to take that, Michael? Yeah. Michael Lauer.
How do you put teeth in a plan? It's a great question. And the way you do it is, first of all, you make sure you... This is the next question, or is this related?
That's the next question.
Okay. You make sure that you reach agreement as a community on what you're trying to accomplish, and make sure that the community leaders know that's what you want to do. So the first part is starting with some consensus. What do we agree to? The other part of that is it may require some legislation. And that's a torturous process of its own, as you probably know. But if there is enough support to do it, to get legislation to enable local authority to address those challenges, that is something it's achievable. It happens in a lot of different states, and it's not uncommon for that to happen. But it starts with the conversation, and I think that that's really what the intention of today's exercises were. I do want to add one thing, though, from this afternoon. This comment came from a couple of different community leaders in that they're not interested in giving up their autonomy. And so there's that balance as we're looking at regional growth and regional growth pressures. How do we deal with those regional issues, yet continue to vest local jurisdictions, the cities, with the power to control their own destinies? And I don't have a good answer for that one. That's a balancing act.
Thank you. All right, Brett, we have a question there, and I just had a request to, when you speak, please put the microphone a little closer to your mouth. Folks are having trouble hearing.
Okay.
Please.
Andy Seelum with Meridian Planning and Zoning. To kind of continue on, I'm one of the people that gets to read all those reports. We read reports that come in from ACHD, from the Western Ada School District, and what I've found is the involvement between the different agencies is very, very low. There's no path to follow where myself as a planning and zoning commissioner, I don't know when a hearing is going to be held for ACHD to rule on a development that might be coming in, for instance. So my question basically is, how do we get better involvement between all the different agencies, better communication, more effective communication for people like me that have to make decisions on these things? The other thing I'm seeing in these reports, and not to pick on ACHD, but a report will come in and it'll use data that's 3 to 5 years old. The report says, we're okay. I have to act on that report because that's the information that I'm given. And also, I mean, we get things from Western Ada School District that kind of is the stock letter that comes along and says, yeah, we'll support it best we can. By the way, it'd be great if somebody wanted to give us some land. I mean, there's just a lot of information that seems to be missing or lacking or doesn't have teeth. How do we have the agencies better communicate and effectively work with each other going down this road in the future, instead of, I mean, right now it just seems like we're getting enough information to kind of rubber stamp when things go through.
Yeah.
Hi, I'd like to comment on that. Brand new, Ada County Commissioner, well, not brand new, but 10 months into this, and not in the land use planning profession. So I'm looking at this through the same eyes and lens as you are, and asking these exact same questions. So I'm really excited to listen tonight and hear what the questions and the concerns are. I certainly don't have all the answers. But one of the things that we started doing just recently in our public land use hearings is we're inviting ACHD to bring a representative to the public hearing to testify to that particular subdivision. So we have them there and talking about that specific property, so we're not just looking at them faxing over a piece of paper or something. So that hopefully will be helpful. We just started that process. We've also invited the school districts, if there's schools involved, to come. We want them to come and tell us that if we approve something or we phase it in a certain way that these kids have a school to go to, instead of just saying, yeah, that was in our strategic plan, and then we find out later they're busing the kids somewhere else. And so we're inviting them to the public hearings to testify for you. So we're getting all the same information at the same time. So we're taking baby steps like that along the way, so any suggestions, we're really open to listening to. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question back here, Brett.
Hi, Dan McQueston, live up in Hidden Springs. A couple of questions. The first one is Ada County Highway District as an entity itself I think it's not a very common situation across the country that the counties are controlling the roads and controlling the throughways, and then the cities are doing something different. And the experience that I've heard from planning people in Star and clearly in Meridian and Boise too and Garden City is it's a communication issue. And is the ACHD, the way it's positioned with doing a roads, is that the best way to do it, and should it be changed? That would be for our experts who know
so
the
that's
stuff
not a
in the country.
rhetorical question. Okay.
It's not a topic because it's about growth, and it seems like it's a bottleneck at ACHD level.
Carson, you want to take that?
So I think I heard you say, is it common for most states to fund highways the way that they do here in Idaho? Is that right? No, I misspoke. Okay.
I misspoke. Is it common for a county to be involved in the planning situation with the cities as controlling the roads?
Oh, I got you. And Michael can certainly weigh in on this as well. But it is fairly common from our experience that the counties do have some control, and it varies from state to state, over certain roads within the community. One of the issues that we have developing impact fees is there are sometimes county roads within a jurisdiction, and you've got to enter into a local or intergovernmental agreement with the jurisdiction to collect the impact fee for the use on the county roads. Same with police and sheriff or fire and other things. So it is fairly common to have some jurisdiction. Yeah.
And I want to pick up on that if that's okay. So what, just to be clear, Ada County is a separate entity from ACHD. So you'll call us about the paramedics or the jail or weed and pest, but you'll call a completely separately elected entity for your roads. And I think that is what is somewhat uncommon, is that it is a standalone agency.
Michael, you want to build on that?
I was going to echo that is, it's not that usual to have a separate entity that has all the roads, unless you're in North Carolina, in which case the state owns all county roads. County doesn't own any roads, doesn't pay for any of them. But that aside, your question is this the best structure? I think potentially this can be a very workable structure because you have one entity coordinating all of these things. But as we've heard from the other comments, it only works if that coordination between ACHD and the applicable jurisdictions takes place. I mean, it's potentially a good model. Clearly, there are concerns that it's not working at its optimal state right now.
Brianna, there's a question right behind you in a yellow shirt.
First off, I'd like to thank the experts for coming. My name is Lee Joe Lay. I'm a construction worker first, and I've been the first guy delivering the first piece of equipment to every new subdivision almost in this valley, and most of them have been on farm ground, and most of you, and me included, are not happy about that. Am I wrong? So we are at an Ada County Commissioners meeting, and they have jurisdiction over planning and zoning, and that's about it. Not much to do with the roads, and that's ACHD. So what I see around this valley is the traffic problem and where we're building at, and most of the farm ground here is optioned in Ada County, is optioned by developers already, and we are taking that farm ground out of production, and the agriculture industry out of production in the entire valley. Agriculture is a second economy that helps keep us floating when construction goes south, which it does, every 8 or 9 years. So my question for the commissioners is we have a giant desert to the south. Nobody wants to live there because it doesn't have an irrigation system. It doesn't have water to it. I've put 2 subdivisions in close to Micron, and it has rocks in the ground that make it a little more expensive to develop. My question is, can the commissioners limit growth, basically draw a circle around each town, and say this has to be high density, and put the impact fees to a point where we can shove roads to the south deserts and shove roads to the and irrigation projects to the south deserts, so people will want to live out there where we can get traffic on more empty roads coming this direction. And there's a rail system coming from that side as well. Can we get an emphasis on South Desert and some limited foothill development where we're displacing housing, that could be built down here? I mean, that we're limiting building in the foothills, and that's forcing more building in the valley on the farm ground. What are your thoughts?
So if I'm to sort of encapsulate what you're saying, you're essentially painting the picture of a scenario, which is one of the pieces that Michael and Carson talked about. Over the next several months, Compass is going to be looking at these various types of growth scenarios, and we'll be surveying folks to see which kinds of scenarios they prefer. The other piece that you heard about tonight, which is something we're doing as a collective, I believe for the first time, is understanding what these different scenarios are going to cost us. And that's what's really, really critical. To the second part of your question, can the Ada County Commissioners force a boundary around each city? In a word, no. We do not have the authority to do that. And we could go into all the legislative changes that would have to occur to make that happen. But for today's point of view, we held a meeting with each of your city's elected officials. We've met with ACHD twice to start to road test these conversations. And today is the beginning of a process where we want to talk about the hard conversations of, can we build consensus about how we grow? Can we actually implement some policy changes that will make it more applicable when something comes to planning and zoning, so you see how that looks? So it's not as clean of an answer as maybe we would all hope it to be. It's going to be a process for us to get there.
That's a great question. Thank you. We have time for just a few more questions. Anybody else have something burning? There's a hand there.
My name's Todd. I live in Meridian. My question specifically for you, Carson. You gave 2 scenarios, development in Phoenix and then and the taxing structure or whatever there, and then in Ohio and how they do it differently there. Of those 2 options, in your opinion, which is the better scenario? Which one works the best as far as fiscal responsibility for development and improvements?
I don't have an answer for that. That's a value proposition. Each have their own side effects. For instance, in the Arizona model, in fact, this is a book idea I've had forever. It's just I'm too lazy to write it. And that is how revenue structures influence the physical development pattern. So if you have a sales tax-based revenue structure, all the jurisdictions are competing for retail, right? And they go out and they annex, strip commercial centers and leave all the other land that they should be serving because they're better able to serve it because they're a city and they provide urban services. They're leaving it unserved, right? So that has consequences. In the alternative, you just have different issues. One, you're still competing for economic development. It's just you're competing for different types of economic development. And then you have winners and losers in terms of, the Dublin, Ohios of the world, which is a Columbus suburb, which is booming because of all the economic development it gets because of its educated workforce. Then somebody else has to house all the workers, and they're not getting any revenue from it. So it has its unintended consequences as well. So there is no wrong or right or best revenue structure in terms, in my opinion, that you should follow, because they all have unintended consequences. Well, I think, I think that's a great follow-up. I think you've got to diversify your revenue base so that you have more than one primary growth-related revenue. A lot of states, I give you the Maryland example, but other states like Illinois, they not only have property tax, but they've got income tax. You either need to have property tax, income tax, property tax, sales tax, property tax and large franchise fees, something like that, so that it sort of balances those externalities, so to speak.
We have time for one more question. I have a hand. Well, we have, let's see, 2 hands. Let's see. We'll start up here. And I haven't heard from you, sir, yet, so we'll go to you. You'll be our last question.
My name's Josie, and then I live in Meridian. My question is, what are we doing with the jobs, though, market? Because you can add the taxes all you want, but if people don't have a good jobs, that tax will not add up to a revenue that is going to build the infrastructure. So I think what it needs to be, the city needs to welcome more jobs like factories that hire more people with good paying jobs. That way, when we have the taxes added, then it will pay off. But if people are still working with jobs with minimum payment, really, if you raise the taxes, I don't see the big impact that is going to come from that. Another thing I see here in this room is the communication, the lack of communication. What can we do with that? Because the city said, okay, we don't talk with HUD that look for housing. They do whatever they think they can do. The city say, okay, go ahead and build here. The farms are going. The housing market is going up. So really, my concern is I can see that we're going to end up with more homeless at the street when I see how things are going because of the growth. I don't know if the city was ready for this growth that was coming. One of the experts said people didn't want to provide it to be ready for the inevitable. And then when it comes, and there you go, what the situation we are in right now. What are we going to do right now? I was proposing, there's a lot of people in this room know more than others. If maybe we can vote some people from each city, representing each city, they can be working with the city and the HUD. When they have a meeting, those people are there. So to be able to present the issues of their community, of their people they represent, that way there is a fairness of the game and how these things are going to be working out.
Okay, these are great comments. Carson, you want to respond? Mic's on its way.
I really want to respond to the other question that was asked prior about revenue structures. One thing I didn't mention is that the question was, is there a best way? In our experience, when there's a recognition that there's a collective we, and we're all in this together from a regional perspective, and you set up jurisdictional revenue sharing programs or sales tax, which I know you're not authorized to do at this point, but is shared using some sort of formula. Those tend to be better because everybody shares in the spoils. And there is a model in Minneapolis, St. Paul, which is, and I'm not a socialist, but it's the closest form of socialism that we have in this country. It's called the Metro Council of Government. Michael Lauer is probably familiar with this. But in 1974, the counties around Minneapolis, St. Paul came together, and they said, we're in this together. In order to stop regional competition for economic development, we're going to create this system of taxation, and it's called the Fiscal Disparities Act. And in simple terms, the communities that are the haves, and your assessed base for commercial and industrial development is frozen at 1974 levels, and the increment above that goes into this pool. And each year that pool of money is distributed to the haves pay in, the have-nots received. Now, we've done a lot of work with the Metro Council over the last 20 years, and most recently with the legislature, to look at how successful it has been. And one of the findings was that over the time period from 1974 until about 2015, I think it was, or 2016, about half of the haves had become have-nots, and the have-nots have become haves. And so a lot of people think it's been very effective in terms of balancing economic opportunities and and basically not cutting off your nose to spite your face because you're a region. And so that's just one of the more innovative things that have happened in the United States. Other than that, the only examples you can point to are just these jurisdictional revenue sharing ideas like Thornton, Colorado, and Westminster, Colorado have, where they were both going to be fighting for the same areas for annexation, and they basically said, hey, let's not fight each other, let's just split the revenue. And so those tend to be better situations in terms of revenue structures.
Thanks, Carson. I just want to make sure we acknowledge the comment about wages and jobs and homelessness as well. I know that that is something that's of concern for many folks. Is there any panelist who wants to say anything about that? It was more a comment than a question, but. Michael.
I think I did mention it when I was talking up front, that as you try to manage growth, one of the bad side effects is very often that you end up increasing some costs. You make it difficult to provide affordable housing. And so those kinds of, when you're designing those programs, you have to be conscious of that potential effect and then figure out how you're going to deal with it. Down in the Keys, they have a rate of growth ordinance. The Florida Keys are this giant cul-de-sac that runs from Miami down to Key West. And they had a rate of growth ordinance because they could only evacuate so many people. And we have really kind of a limited window to get out of there when we know the hurricane's coming. It's just one of those joys of coastal living in Florida. So in doing that, they created a housing affordability problem, and so they designed a program called Housing for Heroes, where they figured out how do we make housing affordable for our workforce, our teachers, our firefighters, our policemen. How do we get that part of the equation taken care of? And that was something that they have been really focused on and done quite a good job of.
Thank you.
That doesn't address the homeless question, though. I'm acknowledging that and acknowledging I haven't answered it, but that's the best I can do.
All right, we have one last question right over here for tonight, and then I'll turn things over to the commissioner.
Hi, my name is Lou Germano. I'm from Eagle. I actually have a comment and a question. My comment relates to what we just heard about economic development. I don't think that was emphasized enough. You can't expect to continue to find new ways to tax homeowners and fund all of this new development. It's just not going to happen. We need new businesses with higher paying jobs in this community. And somehow all of Ada County and all of the cities need to find some way to tie together their economic development plans so we can attract people. If this is a good place to live, it's also a good place to work. And then my question really has to do is I'd like to hear from someone from Ada County. I attended a workshop session like this 10 to 15 years ago. We had outside experts here. We had people from the community. We did workshops. We made all sorts of great plans, and nothing happened. So I'd like to know specifically what's different this time. Are you operating under some sort of mandate? Do you have some way of making these things happen? Or is this just all voluntary? And I hate to be negative, but that's not going to get us anywhere.
Well, that's a great question, and maybe Commissioner Laciando is a good time for you to jump in.
That's great. So I'm going to close it up, and actually that provides a really great segue perfect closing. So if you have been here for a while, you do know that 12-ish years ago, there was a similar attempt, started out with ACHD, and it was called the Blueprint for Good Growth. And Michael Lauer was actually a part of that. And some really good things did come out of that process, but to your point, it didn't reach its full potential. Commissioner Kenyon and I were just sworn in about 10 months ago. I was not a part of that process back in the day, nor was she, and nor were about 3/4 of the people who are currently sitting on all the city councils, ACHD, et cetera. And if I'm to summarize, what fell apart last time, it really was this lack of willingness from individual jurisdictions to come together on some policy ordinance changes. There's the very beginning of a process where you say, yeah, we're all gonna work together, and then there's the part where you have to make hard decisions. And so, starting over the last few weeks and months, we've been meeting with all of our cities to talk about the need for this. We've been meeting with ACHD, but that's why this meeting is the most critical of all, because we believe that the tone, the tenor, and the time has changed where the community is asking for this. It's not just asking, it's crying for it. And so you've received an education today in what some of the tools potentially are, what some of the impacts and opportunities are, just the same as all of the elected officials have received. And so my ask of you is to make this the first in a series of engagements that you would make with us. Over the next several months, Compass is going to actually be doing that fiscal impact analysis. They're going to be running through all of the city's current comprehensive plans, and they're going to be looking at what our current growth scenario is going to cost us. Now, I can tell you at Ada County, having walked in January and been presented with a binder full of $300 million worth of capital projects that we didn't have a plan to pay for, we don't have the money. We do not have the money right now. So how are we going to fund that, and how are we going to fund the build-out scenario? I honestly don't know. So this was our cry for help, and we believe that when those numbers come back, there may be other jurisdictions who look at their numbers and feel the same way. And that's why we started out from the fiscal conversation, because we may have different values about open space or density or conservation, et cetera, but at the end of the day, we're all taxpayers. And that's what's important, to have this conversation from a grounded level of data, to understand what is it going to cost us. And if we don't like those numbers, then we're going to need to demand some change. So I want to thank you all again for being here. We really very much appreciate your engagement. I also want to note again that Ada County's role in this is not that we're going to tell the cities what to do, but we are going to be the convener. We are going to be making sure that we're collaborating with all of our cities, and we are going to be providing data and information to them, but maybe even more importantly to you, so that you know what we're up to and how you can be involved in the process. So thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for being here tonight. The slides that you saw tonight will be on Ada County's growth website. You can see them there if you want to consult them. Have a great rest of your evening. Drive safe.